One of the biggest disputes between buyers and sellers during the sale of a property is around latent and patent defects. And at the end of the day, we only have the law to refer to. And to provide insight, I'm now joined by conveyancing attorney Marius van Rensburg. Marius, welcome back to All About Property.
Thank you, Cornelius.
Now, before we get into latent and patent defects, let's first talk about the Voetstoots Clause, because there's a lot of uncertainty around the Voetstoots Clause, and to what extent does it actually protect the seller?
You know, Cornelius, it's a really important topic, and we often give talks on the Voetstoots Clause, and the response is not another talk on the Voetstoots Clause. But the fact is, it's fundamental to the way we buy and sell property in South Africa. And there's actually a lot of confusion around the clause. You know, there's a lot of talk that the clause doesn't apply anymore, that with the advent of the CPA, it's no longer applicable. It is absolutely applicable. And the Voetstoots Clause essentially means that the property is sold as is or in the condition in which it stands on the date of sale. So what the buyer buys is the property in the condition in which it stands when they buy the property. So it's fundamental from that point of view, and the parties have different obligations to comply with the Voetstoots Clause, and they need to understand those obligations and understand what a patent and a latent defect is in order to comply with their responsibilities.
Now let's talk about this. What is a patent and a latent defect? And just give us examples of these.
Okay.
And so I'm going to load this question. How does that relate to the Voetstoots Clause? Because you just said Voetstoots Clause is still very much part of the law.
Absolutely. So a patent defect is a defect that a buyer can see on a reasonable inspection of the property. A latent defect is a defect that can't be seen with the naked eye. So the buyers and the seller have to understand what their responsibilities are. The property is sold as it is with all latent and patent defects. So it gives protection to the seller, but the seller has an obligation. It's not a free ride. The seller has an obligation to disclose to the buyer all latent defects in respect to which the seller has knowledge. The buyer has an obligation to inspect the property. And you know, from my practical experience, this is where the problem comes in. In that the sellers often under-disclose, or they don't disclose properly, because there's a fear that people won't buy their property unless they've, if they're making those disclosures. So what sellers need to do is, and this is what I would do, is go from room to room to room and think about, what am I living with that can't be seen? So for example, take your stove to the place may not be working. For you, it's okay, you can live with it. But that's arguably going to be a latent defect.
Okay.
Buyers, on the other hand, also have this responsibility. So if I'm a buyer and I'm going to buy a property, I walk into the property and I start at the gate. Does the electric motor work? Does the electric fence work? I go into the first room. I go from room to room. I look at the cornices. I look at the skirtings. I open all the cupboards. I look inside the cupboards. Is there damp in there? That's my right. I'm a buyer. I'm going to look in those cupboards. If I go to the bathroom, I'm turning on the taps. I'm flushing the toilets. I want to see the water pressure. Your water pressure and my water pressure may be completely different in terms of what's acceptable to us. And this is a buyer's responsibility. I find buyers, they come afterwards and they say, but Marius, we've taken transfer property. I've now gotten into the garage and it's full of damp. So I say, yeah, that's your problem. When you buy a property, go into every part of that property. I have examples where there's a dog, right, and the dog's vicious. So what they do is they don't go and see the side of the house. They move in, there's no dog, there's damp. You didn't see it. Buyer beware, you must inspect the property.
Now, just on that note, if a patent defect is visible, is it still the seller's responsibility to point it out?
No. And I'll give you an example. I have cases where buyers move in after transfer. They call me and they say to me, Marius, there's damp in this property. It's on the front wall as you walk in. I say, was the damp there when you bought the property? Yes, it was. Well, then it's a patent defect, and it's your responsibility, not the seller's responsibility. The seller has no obligation to point out patent defects to you as a buyer. Your obligation is to go and inspect that property properly.
Now, let's say the seller does not disclose the latent defect, and the new owner only realizes this after he took registration. What can he do?
You know, to answer this question, there's a legal answer and there's a practical answer. The legal answer is that for a buyer to circumvent or get around a Voetstoots clause, the buyer must prove a number of things. One, that there is a defect, which is a latent defect. Two, the seller was aware of that defect. And three, the seller failed to disclose the defect with the intention of causing harm or defrauding that buyer. Now, that third part is hard to prove, and it has been softened by our courts. So, for example, a seller who tells a half-truth or who fails to disclose or give the real facts about a defect will not get around that Voetstoots clause. They'll be caught. That's the legal side of it. Here's the practical side of it. 99% of these kinds of disputes are low in value. So 10,000, 5,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. You can't litigate for that kind of money in South Africa. The cost of litigation, the stress of litigation outweighs the benefit of the litigation. So parties are always forced into a situation where they compromise, and they have to compromise or feel dissatisfied. And this is why it's important for the general public to understand. Sellers, make a proper disclosure. Your house will sell better, you'll have less problems if you make that proper disclosure. Buyers, inspect the property properly. Know what you're buying. Ask the questions. You have the right to ask the questions.
Marius, we're practically out of time. Any quick last piece of advice on the topic?
Two points. One is that the property practitioners legislation is out. It's probably going to become effective sometime during the course of this year. And people need to note that disclosure documents are going to become obligatory in estate agent-related transactions. The agents are going to have to get a disclosure document. Sellers must complete those disclosure documents as carefully as they can. It can't be done very quickly or without proper foresight. And the last point is exercise your right. Make proper disclosure and inspect properly to avoid the tears and drama that comes after the fact when there's a problem that arises.
Great advice. Marius, thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.